Hi, my name is Nancy Jean, spelled Geanne for some reason, Schneider Collins. I was born in Detroit at Harper Hospital on April 13th, 1943. My mother's name was Beatrice Eleanor Schenk, and she was basically of German heritage. My father was Donald Weston Schneider, and he again was German. So they were both 18 years old when they met. And my mother went to Northwestern High School. My father went to Southeastern. Once he met her, he used to take 3 or 4 buses to go see her. Now, who would do that? After she went off to Michigan, he was going to Wayne. Because he really liked her, he transferred to Michigan. However, my mother decided at that point, when he transferred to Michigan, that she didn't like college and she was going to go to secretarial school. And she did for 1 semester. Said it was much harder than going to Michigan and transferred back again. So they graduated, got married at 25, and at 28 they had me. And when I was 6 months old, my dad was, he was going to enter the Navy, and my mother was pregnant. So he put it off. So when I was 6 months old, they drafted him. He went to the Army and went over to England, where, of all places, they put him in the medical corps. And my father didn't like the sight of blood. For the first 3.5 years of my life, I lived with my grandparents on my mother's side, which was nice. My grandfather taught me, I love tools. He taught me how to build things. My grandmother taught me how to sew. My mother couldn't put a button on in the right spot. She didn't like gardening, and she certainly didn't like tools. So it was nice. And in the summers, we lived at a cottage. We used to go out fishing in the morning, and we'd come home and cook perch or bluegill or whatever there was for breakfast. Which you had to clean your own fish. That was the rule. My mother wasn't crazy about her dad. I think he was rather a boisterous person, which he was. He always went to his cupboard and had a shot of liquor in the morning. Good German, I guess. When my father came back from the war, he was stationed down in California, so my mother left. Took the train out there. She was gone for about 3 weeks, and then she came back, and then he came back. And 9 months later, my brother was born. So we lived there for a while. My parents built our house in Detroit. It was a side entrance colonial 3-bedroom. I remember it fondly. The area is not quite the same anymore. We built a house on Huntington in Detroit, which is near Outer Drive and 6 Mile. It was a side entrance colonial. You walked in, the stairs were to the left, the living room was to the right with a big bay window. Dining room was behind, the kitchen was straight ahead as you walked in. Upstairs, there's a powder room, which from the kitchen, under the main stairs, with the stairs going down to the basement, and you went out the door to the driveway. It was a 1-car garage. And upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms and 1 main bathroom. My parents had a nice-sized bedroom. Mine was sort of average-sized, but I did have a porch off the back of my room, which my brother's best friend, your grandfather's best friend, lived next door. And so they used to set up walkie-talkies, which went through my bedroom, and there was a lot between the 2 houses. It was really nice. A lot of kids on the block. I was a tomboy until about 10 or 11, and my mother told me I had to stop beating the boys or I'd never get a date. I loved art when I was a kid, and I was good at math. When I got into high school, I swam on the swim team for a while. However, having naturally curly hair, and they didn't have blow dryers then, so I quit the team. It was a real trauma for me. Dating. Let's see, dating. I did date. My first boyfriend, there were 2. Bill Elliott and Kenny Shane and I came back from the summer, and my friend said that they used to give girls a ring. And this is your grandmother. And my friend said, both Bill and Kenny are going to ask you to go study with them. So I said, what should I do? And she said, just accept both of them. When you're with one, wear his ring, and when you're with the other, wear his ring. And that's what I did, but it didn't last very long. In high school, they had sororities, and I was in one with a lot of friends. In fact, one of my friends from high school was in my wedding. Anyways, they had sororities. It was different. It was nice. You get in them when you're basically 9th grade. However, when I went to college, I ended up joining a sorority in college. But when I went to college, I really thought the sororities were in high school. I didn't like the fact that they chose people. You know what I mean? It made people feel like outsiders because not everyone got picked to be in a sorority. And I also didn't like the fact that they did the thing where you had to eat chocolate-covered worms, and I just refused to do it. Ah, a story. Okay, I remember this story. I was driving now. We were going to a swim meet, and I took my dad's brand new Oldsmobile. And the library was right across from the high school, so I parked behind the high school. Now, remember, we all smoked back then. So we came out the swim meet, and I look at my dad's car, and it's filled with smoke. And so someone had thrown a cigarette out the window. You had these little side windows, and then the main window, and it had gone in the back seat, and so the back seat got on fire, and it burned a great big hole. So my friends went in the library and brought out buckets, and we were throwing water on this car. Anyways, my solution was you could pull the seat out. So I pulled the seat out, put it in the trunk, and drove to the fire station. Well, the fireman went berserk. He said, "That's right next to the gas tank." I didn't even think about it. Anyways, he called my parents, and I thought my father's gonna kill me. And he was not happy. I didn't get to use his car for quite a while after that. When college came around, I applied to Michigan, Michigan State, and I wanted to apply to Northwestern, but I think my dad thought it was too expensive. But I got in both of them, and I went to Michigan. My parents had both gone there. But I wanted to go into art school, and my dad talked me out of that. So I went to LSA because he said, and he was right in this way, in art school, you didn't have to have math, you didn't have to have sciences, you didn't have to have languages, which he said are important. So I went to LSA and basically majored in math. I have to say, when I was at Michigan in math, I actually had professors asking me why I was there and taking the place of a boy. I mean, that was pretty bad. And the girls had hours, the boys did not. You couldn't live in an apartment until you were a senior. I had fun in college, I had a good time, but it was hard for me trying to decide to switch over. But I switched over my junior year to the art school, and I kept up my math. But I think I had 29 credits, and you had to have 30 to have a major in it. But I did get all but one. But when I went into the art school, basically, except for art history, I think I tested out the science aspect of it. When I went into the art school, it was sort of like 8-hour days. On Saturdays, you were there for like 4 hours, but I was trying to cram it all in at once because you have every credit hour you have for 4 hours a week. Therefore, every credit you're in class for 4 hours. So I had to make up work with all the drawing and painting and all that, but I was much happier in art school. Michigan, I always remember it being very liberal. In fact, when your grandfather was at Michigan State, he got kicked out right after his freshman year because he had a beer right under his jacket. My parents said had he gone to Michigan, he would have gotten kicked out for that. And it's true. And it's very interesting now because I have a couple of good friends that went to Michigan State, and we're both very proud and probably more liberal, definitely, even though I was raised a Republican. But it's interesting because most of my friends from college are all very liberal politically. So anyway, I finished my last year of school, I got engaged, I was 22, which is way too young. And I got married when I was, well, maybe I was 23. I had just graduated and had done that extra year, so I'd probably just turned 23. So I got married in January and moved to Chicago, and I went out to all the architecture firms because that's what I was trained to do. And everyone said, nice, but come back when you have some experience. Which is fun. So I got a job at Northwestern University in their, student health center. I was working a switchboard. It was an old-fashioned switchboard. So 3 months later, I went back again. All the same architecture firms. They said, nice portfolio, but come back when you have some experience. So then 3 months later, I went back again. 3 firms offered me a job. Architecture in Chicago had boomed. Everybody needs somebody. So I worked for the C.F. Murphy Associates, which built McCormick Place, the Chicago Civic Center, a lot of stuff there. I was able to rise very quickly because they just needed people so badly. Chicago was just absolutely booming at the time. So this was 1967. I was there for 6 years until 73. I became a project manager after about a year and a half. I was in charge of the Chicago Civic Center and all floors there. I think that was the best of all the jobs I had, to be honest with you. I really loved it, and I liked the people, and it was very creative, very interesting. Let's go back to when I got married. I remember the proposal. I was happy, But I really didn't want to get married that soon. I really wanted to go out and have a career because I just graduated in May and I got married in January. I adored having my children, but I wanted to have a career, and I said I didn't want to have children right away. So he was fine with that, and he was Catholic, so it didn't bother him, and it didn't bother me. Grandma took me right away to get birth control pills. And then he got transferred to Cleveland. So we moved to Cleveland. I worked for an architecture firm there, which was very nice. We rented a duplex, the upper floor of a duplex, which, now this is interesting. The couple actually asked me, because they didn't allow children, what was I doing to prevent children? Could you think of that today? But Cleveland was nice, a nice architecture firm. It wasn't as good as Chicago, but it was the best one in Cleveland. I worked there for a couple years, gave up smoking there. Anyway, so we lived there. It was nice living there. We moved back to Detroit because Charlie had a business there. Moved to Farmington Hills, worked for Ford and Earl. But then I got pregnant with David, and I was 32, and I wanted to have another child. Yeah, I did, and I knew when I had another child that I wanted to stay home. And by that time, I was happy. I had the career that I wanted, and I was happy to stay home. So I actually stopped working when I was just a couple months pregnant. I did natural childbirth, which was nice, and David was fine. He was 3 weeks early, his birthday was October 7th, and he was supposed to be born like on Halloween or something like that. But he was still 6.5 pounds. One hard part was I was just tired because it was a long time, because they had to keep inducing me to have the baby, but I really enjoyed it after I had the baby. I felt great because I didn't have all that anesthetic or anything. Both of my boys both had a lot of hair when they were born. With his blonde hair, he looked like he had a tan. Blue eyes and a tan. In fact, he was so pretty that people always said he was a girl. He was always dressed in blue because I had my baby showers after he was born, because I was supposed to have them, I think, the week he was born. But anyways, everything went well. I loved being home with my kids. I really liked it. It was really nice. But I sort of missed working a bit. After having my kids, I did consulting work for one of my friends from Ford. She started her own firm, and she did a lot of things with banks. I would bring the work back and do it at home, and David was a very easy child, so I worked at home until I got pregnant with Dan, and that was a little more difficult because I couldn't put my feet up as much. With David, I could do that. They're about 3.5 years apart. David's October, Dana's February, but they were 4 years apart in school because I put David in kindergarten when he was only 4. Oh yeah, thinking back to when I got married. When I went to walk down the aisle, my dad was standing next to me and he said, and he did like Charlie. Grandma was never really crazy about him, but he did like Charlie. But he said, you don't have to get married. I raised you to take care of yourself. So I always knew I could take care of myself. I really did. It just wasn't easy going through the alcoholism part. I'm not a yeller or a screamer. I would just say, don't you think you ought to fix this? I remember one time I was driving David to middle school and he said, Mom, are you sad because Daddy drinks so much? Which breaks your heart. And one time I'm tucking Dan into bed and he said, Daddy didn't mean all those nasty things. He just had too many beers. Your kids know a lot. I worked my tail off thinking I was protecting everything, I just ran myself. I went to the doctor right after I filed for divorce and my blood pressure was 220/110. He says, I don't know why you didn't have a stroke. So, I started taking some pills and it just wasn't a fun thing. He refused to move out of the house, so I had to deal with that. He did not want the divorce. He made me go on with it for 2.5 years. I filed when I was 48 and I got divorced when I was 50. However, now I'm considered a divorced widow and I get Social Security. Sorry about that. Well, it was bad, but he died 3 years later. He drowned. But what happened was we were sailors. We had a fairly good 38-foot boat at a yacht club down in another runabout thing. And he got the boats in the divorce and I got the house. So I wasn't bad off, I knew I didn't need to work, but I wanted to work. The boys were old enough. Dan was in 7th grade and David was a junior in high school. It's interesting, Dan didn't have as fond feelings about his dad as David did. David said one time, he said that he told his dad just before he died. He was in the hospital because he had some seizures, and he said, Don't you think you ought to be a father to Dan? I had a dad till I was 8 years old. He never had a dad, which is sad. Anyways, Charlie was driving to see his boat out in St. Clair Shores, where it was stored. He had gotten rid of the sailboat and had a powerboat, and his car, according to the police, well, all of a sudden he slumped over the wheel of his car and drifted in sideways into the water, and somebody drove in to try and save him, but it's hard to get a 230-pound man out of a seatbelt, so. But the coroner and we got to be quite friendly because I couldn't get a death certificate for a long time because they weren't sure. They knew he was an alcoholic because his heart was 2.5 times the size of normal, and so was his liver, but he had no alcohol in his system. He died on Memorial Day, 3 days absent since '96. I remember one time I was watching Dan play hockey for high school. I just had the first drink in my hand, and I got a call that Charlie had had a grand mal seizure at the hockey game. And so he was in the hospital, and it's very interesting because one night the boys went to see him. It was Christmas Eve, and he was having hallucinations. Now, David came in, and he thought it was funny. Charlie thought the nurse was going to try and kill him and all this kind of thing, and Dan thought it was the most disgusting thing he'd ever seen in his entire life. So you have 2 different ways of looking at it, which is, it's interesting. You worry about your children. When he died, I called David at school. He was out of state then, and I already made a plane reservation for him. He was crying. He was quite upset, I just said, I want you to stay on the phone. I don't want you driving. I want to have one of your friends drive your car to the airport. You've got reservations for this flight. So we just stayed on the phone for a long time until I felt he was under control. Dan was working at this landscaping place. I went up to his boss, Joe, who owned it, and I said, Dan's dad just passed away. Can I take him out of town? So I walked up to him and I said, Hi, Dan. He said, What are you doing here? I said, Well, I came up. I was just talking to Joe. I said, Why don't you come on home? He said, You can get off early. He looked at me and said, Dad died. I said, Yeah. He said, Don't expect me to cry. Very different reactions. After that, I retired from full-time work when I was about 61, 62 because my mom, that's when she had these mini strokes and we had to put her in assisted living. And so I retired from full work then. I got a job for a little bit in Birmingham. I only did 3 months and then left because I thought it was for the Chamber of Commerce there. Could turn into a nice part-time job again. After working part-time for a little bit, I thought about dating, but I really have no desire to get married again, and I really don't think I ever will. And maybe because I didn't have a good experience with it, but then again, I look at my parents who had a lovely marriage. Let's move on from that. Anyways, what am I looking forward to? Oh, well, maybe doing a few things that are on my bucket list. Maybe a little traveling. I enjoy my grandchildren because they're out of town. I have to admit, Nicole one time said, Would you ever think of moving in, living with us? When they were looking for a bigger house. And I didn't want to scream and say, Oh, God, no. I don't want to live with my children. I like being a grandmother, but I don't want to babysit. If there's one last thing I want to say, it's that I think it's important for women to have a lot of friends. And not just a husband or whatever. I think friendship is very important. And I think family is very important. And I think being independent and taking care of yourself. I don't understand. I have friends who, I was very lucky when I got divorced because Charlie didn't like to manage money. So I managed everything even till we divorced. I signed his paychecks and put them in the bank. And he just didn't like to deal with it. And I find it amazing that I have friends who have absolutely no idea what their husbands have. And their husbands aren't that healthy. And say, Oh, well, my kids will just take care of everything. I think you ought to take care of yourself. I think that's important.